Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's virtual forum event hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of you as GU Politics. My name is Ava Vitanovic, and I'm a sophomore in the college studying government. During my time at Georgetown, I have greatly enjoyed my involvement with GU Politics, including being a member of GU Votes, joining the Hoyas in Politics and Public Service podcast team, and most recently, serving on fellow Liz Smith's Student Strategy team this fall. I am pleased to introduce our panelists today. Jocelyn Benson is the 43rd Secretary of State of Michigan, and Frank LaRose is the 51st Secretary of State of Ohio. Both secretaries serve together as co-chairs of the Election Committee of the National Association of Secretaries of State. Please join the conversation on social media using the hashtag GUVirtualForum and by tagging GU Politics at GU Politics. Tonight's event will be moderated by GU Politics' Executive Director, Mo Alithi, who is going to kick us off.
Thanks, Ava. Thanks for the great introduction. Thanks for your continued involvement and leadership at GU Politics and at Georgetown. Looking forward to seeing you on campus whenever it is that we can get back there. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight, members of the Georgetown community that are here in the Zoom, and members of the broader community that may be tuning in on our social media. I'm very excited about this conversation. Look, before coming back to Georgetown to run this institute, I spent 20 years working in politics. And every election, I would say, was an unprecedented election. But this one really is. This is an election unlike any we have ever seen, in large part because of the COVID pandemic and how it has impacted so many different aspects of our lives, not the least of which is our opportunity for civic participation and voting. We've been dealing with this since the spring, as many states were going through their primaries, and now we're getting ready we are already dealing with it with the general election, with many states already able to cast their votes. We're seeing an unprecedented number of people who are voting early by mail or in person. And it's just changed how we look at things. And so I'm very excited to have with us tonight a bipartisan pairing of secretaries of state who, as Ava said, head up the election committee for the National Association of Secretaries of State, but who represent two states that I think we're all going to be watching very, very closely in this election. So Secretary Benson, Secretary LaRose, thank you both for being with us tonight. I want to kind of just start the conversation at the most broad level because there's a lot of conversation, a lot of competing information, some misinformation about the process this cycle. And both of you have been very, very active in looking for ways to help clear that up. So I'm hoping that you can kind of help us talk through fact versus fiction on some of this stuff. And I want to start primarily with the vote by mail issue. Critics sort of make a couple of arguments. The first is that it is rife for the potential of widespread fraud. And so, Secretary LaRose, maybe we can start with you in addressing that issue. What do you say to those people who believe that the system is open to widespread fraud?
Well, the best thing to combat false information like that is to share the truth. And as it relates to the way that absentee voting is administered in Ohio, and I can't speak for the other states, but I know that my colleagues in the other states do a very good job of following their state's laws as well. We have a process that is time tested in Ohio. We've been doing absentee voting for close to 20 years. Ohioans in large numbers from both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have, over those close to 2 decades, trusted this as a convenient way to cast their ballot. We have important safeguards in place in Ohio that people should know about. First of all, in Ohio, we have an absentee voting process, not a universal vote by mail process. So in Ohio, you have to prove your identity before you even request a ballot. I sent these out to every registered voter in the state. I'm proud to say we now have 8 million registered voters in the state. All of them got one of these. That is an absentee ballot request form. Not only did I send those out, but parties and candidates tend to send them out. We've seen them published in newspapers so people can simply rip them out of the pages of the newspaper. We've really tried to make those as widely available as we can, and it's working. We've already had close to 2.5 million Ohioans requested their absentee ballot. That's far and away more than we've ever seen in any year in the past. But again, you have to prove your identity when you request a ballot. You have to prove your identity again when you mail that ballot back. The Board of Elections receives that with your name and last four of your social security number or your state driver's license number. They verify that with your date of birth and with the signature that's on file with the Board of Elections. And that's just before they even mail you out your ballot. Of course, Ohioans also have the ability to track their ballot, both while it's on the way to their home and when they mail it back. You can simply go to our website, voteohio.gov, and track it to make sure it's received at the Board of Elections. We also do things like work to really maintain an accurate voter roll in Ohio. That's what's required by both federal and state law. And so we carry out our duty to maintain the accuracy of our voter rolls in Ohio. Ohio prohibits a practice that has caused concern in other states called ballot harvesting. In Ohio, the only way to return your absentee ballot is to mail it back or to have a family member personally deliver it to the Board of Elections, or you yourself personally deliver it to the Board of Elections. Of course, most Ohioans choose to mail back their absentee ballot. And because of those safeguards, Ohioans know they can trust this process, but also it has to do with just the very nature of how elections are administered in Ohio. It's a completely bipartisan process. And when it feels lately like folks there in Washington can't agree what day of the week it is between the two parties, in Ohio, everything we do in elections is thoroughly bipartisan. In fact, every morning, teams of Republicans and Democrats come to work together at their county boards of elections and do this really high stakes, high impact, high stress, candid work of running elections. And that is just another reason why Ohioans know they can trust it.
Secretary Benson, same question.
And really, same answer. Frankly, a lot of the work that we do in Michigan, it has been to follow best practices that have been in place for decades in states like a Washington or a Colorado, where you have time-tested security protocols to ensure that only valid and validated voters are getting ballots. And then once received back, the ballots are then validated by that same signature match system. And in Michigan, if there's a missing signature or a mismatched signature, clerks then follow up and reach out to voters to verify their identity through other means. And so we've got these protocols in place, and they've been embraced by voters on either side of the aisle. Notably, we're also on track to have more citizens voting by mail or voting early than ever before. And 1.2 million citizens have already voted in Michigan, with 3 weeks yet to go in our elections. That's about 25% of the people who voted total in the 2016 election. So that, to me, shows the proof is in the pudding. Voters trust the system. Voters are voting absentee in record numbers as a result. And, bottom line is, if we catch any incident of fraud with those protocols we've got in place, I refer to the Attorney General for investigation and swift justice.
Just a reminder to the members of the Georgetown community in the Zoom, in a little while, we're going to go to your questions. You can begin submitting them now or at any point during the program at the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Someone will let you know when you're ready, when we're ready to take your question, at which point you'll be on screen and can ask directly yourself. Let me stay with you, Secretary Benson, because the other area of concern that people have with the system is less about fraud and more about error. And they raise questions about too many ballots being discarded because of simple errors, that signatures were in the wrong place on the envelope, or things along those lines, or that an already stretched thin election system in a locality or a state is suddenly going to be overwhelmed by these large numbers that you're talking about without much more additional support. So I'm wondering if maybe you can address some of those concerns.
Yeah, what you've just underscored is the work we've done over the past nearly 2 years now, since I took office in January of 2019, to prepare for this very election, anticipating the intense scrutiny would be under. And then as we have moved along in the process, this will actually be our fourth election that has been administered in Michigan this year, we've been able to track data, implement best practices through task forces that we've developed and put in place in January of 2019 on election security and election administration to bring the best practices of administration to Michigan and particularly hone in on these errors, recognizing that, though one of the silver linings of 2020 is that we have so many options to vote more than ever before in Michigan and throughout the country, and then the propensity for voter error as well as clerical errors on behalf of election administrators is just amplified under those circumstances. So taking advantage of the fact that we're not the first state to administer a vote by mail election in a high intense environment, we talked to and implemented the best practices that other states have developed over time. Things like the signature cure system that I mentioned earlier, where clerks are required to follow up if there's a missing signature or a mismatched signature for voters. But we've also, beginning this year in particular, moved forward on kind of three vectors. One, building the infrastructure to withstand the record turnout and record numbers of people voting by mail for the first time, which we've by and large done by both the Federal CARES Act funding and resources that have been provided through private philanthropy to ensure we've got enough machines and enough people and poll workers recruited to administer elections effectively and securely. Number two, educating the public about this infrastructure that we've built so that they know their options and feel secure and safe about choosing the one that works best for them. And then three, preparing to combat misinformation. As we've, I can talk in greater details, I'm sure we will, about each of those three areas. But the bottom line is that we've used data-driven decision-making at every step of the way to both prepare our voters to minimize the propensity for error, and then prepare our system to also minimize the potential for error or other challenges. And the only really outstanding variable has been the misinformation that we know is going to only escalate in the days ahead, trying to sow seeds of doubt among the electorate and the general public about the work we have done to prepare to avoid the types of concerns that you've talked about.
Secretary Lawrence.
Just as Secretary Benson said, this work for us started likewise 2 years ago when I was sworn into office. Of course, we knew that Ohio was going to be getting ready for a presidential election. That's a time when we know the eyes of the world are on the Buckeye State. And as I told our elections officials from the very beginning, we needed to be prepared to shine when the world was watching. Of course, that work became that much more intense and profound when in March we all started adjusting to this new set of circumstances that we have to operate under. Our boards of elections routinely see 25% of their ballots come in by mail. That's historically over the last 20 years. And so boards of elections are built with that type of infrastructure in place that they can account for about a quarter of their ballots to come in by mail. Of course, we know that number is going to go much higher this year. I've been saying since March that the boards of elections should be prepared for that number to double potentially, and we're well on track to see that actually come to fruition. That's why when we received millions of dollars of federal CARES Act money, we pushed it right out the door. I've long had a pet peeve about it. This comes from my time in the military. I spent 10 years in uniform. The resources need to go to where the action is. I always got annoyed when I was one of those guys that was out on the front line and we lacked something that we needed, but then you'd go back to the headquarters where people never have mud on their boots and they live in an air-conditioned building and they seem to have like the coolest new scope on their rifle or whatever. I always said, if I'm in a position to allocate resources, I'm going to push them down to the people that really need them. And so in Ohio, that meant getting those resources out to our county boards of elections. They've used those dollars to buy extra mail handling equipment. For a small rural county board of elections, even that $1,000 machine that cuts open envelopes is a big process improvement, because maybe previously they cut open envelopes by hand and now they can cut open 100 a minute on a machine. That kind of thing can make a real difference. And they've spent those dollars to make those kinds of improvements, as well as to bring in temporary staff. Now, as it relates to making sure that this is a good customer service experience and we can prevent the kind of errors that voters routinely make, we've actually retooled the process for how we mail out those ballots and what sort of information comes with them, because we knew that we were going to see more first-time absentee voters this year than ever, and we wanted that to be a good experience for them. So it started with redesigning the envelopes. Those envelopes have been redesigned working in coordination with the U.S. Postal Service so that they move more quickly through the process and they're very noticeable. They all have something like this, that elections mail logo on them, so that you can recognize that, but also the instruction forms that come with the ballots. We designed it as a simple checklist where voters can follow along the checklist and make sure that they hit all of the things they need to make sure that ballot envelope, the identification envelope, is properly filled out, and that's working. We know that Ohioans are appreciating the clarified and more simple instructions. We know what the common errors are. We know that the most common error is putting today's date where the date of birth goes. We know that one of the other common errors is not putting your signature on there. We know that when voters make those errors, that our boards of elections have been required. I have directed them to work with the voters to make those right. Because let's be clear, those hundreds of people that work at our boards of elections, their job isn't to make it hard or to prevent you from voting or to be the gatekeeper, so to speak. Their job is to help you vote. Their job is to help you work through the process. And so if somebody makes one of those errors when they send in their absentee ballot, I've instructed the boards of elections to get on the phone or get on email and to contact that voter and to help to make it right. And that's exactly what they're expected to do. Because again, we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to make their voice heard in this election.
So before we turn to election day itself, I want to stay on the issue of early voting, because there's sort of, I didn't mention it earlier, but there's sort of a third part of the argument, which I actually think is a little bit more of an evergreen argument that people have been having for quite some time now. And that's just accessibility to early voting. And so I'm wondering if you can both talk about that. There's obviously a lot of questions about the mail system, right? And so a lot of people are looking for other opportunities outside of the Postal Service. And some of it is early in-person voting. Some of it is drop boxes. And Secretary LaRose, you've been dealing with some issues around drop boxes in Ohio and how many there should be, right? I'm wondering if you can each talk a little bit about accessibility and how voters can feel confident that they will, no matter what form they choose, be able to have the same opportunity as everybody else.
I'm happy to start and weigh in on the options that citizens have to vote in Michigan this year and our work to educate them on each of them. I mean, in Michigan, you can vote early, but through the mail system, getting your ballot through the mail, and then returning it either through the mail at your local drop box or in person at your local clerk's office, or you could pick up your ballot at your local clerk's office and return it at the same place as long as it's in before 8 p.m. on election day, or you could vote in person on election day. And if you do that, or if you vote in person at your clerk's office, you'll be met with election workers who have been tested and are COVID negative, but just in case also have PPE, masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, sneeze guards, everything in place to ensure that we're following CDC protocols, social distancing and the like, to ensure safe voting environments for people in person. The challenge has been making sure, again, sort of we built the system. The challenge has been making sure voters know about it and have faith in it. And we found that to be a continuous effort that has been bolstered by the fact that the reason we have these options in Michigan is not because a legislature or governor imposed them on our citizens. Citizens themselves amended our state constitution in 2018 to create these options. They ended up being quite prescient given the challenges of this year. And so that's also given us a leg up on states like Pennsylvania that had legislative approval of these policies, because voters, for the most part, already know about them and supported them. And so for us, working to adjust and adapt to the current changes, particularly with the Postal Service, has been key. But we built that infrastructure quite solidly early on, and now our focus has been on, again, educating voters about their options, and then again, countering misinformation that's designed to cause them to doubt these options or their safety or accessibility. And I'll also note, again, data-driven decision-making has helped us hone in on the challenges in Detroit in particular, and in Flint, our largest jurisdictions, to make sure that we are planning out, and creating additional lines of accessibility. So in Detroit, for the first time ever, we have 21 satellite office locations, 30 Dropbox locations, and we have recruited 8,000 additional staff for the city alone to help ensure smooth processing of absentee ballots, both going out and coming in and being tabulated on election day, as well as various other resources that have created more opportunities than ever before for voters in our most concentrated and largest jurisdictions to have increased access to the vote.
Here in Ohio, we pride ourselves on being a leader in the nation in making it convenient for voters. Ohioans know that it is easy to vote. In fact, 93% in a recent survey conducted by CBS News responded that it's easy to vote here in Ohio. And here's what the facts show. We have 216 hours of early voting. We're a leader in the nation. Only 5 states have more early voting than we do. That includes Sunday voting and Saturday voting. That truly makes it easy for people that want that in-person experience to be able to do that. We have an absentee voting system that was ranked highly by the Brookings Institution recently, that evaluated all 50 states and specifically the states that offer absentee voting, and Ohio ranked at the top of those absentee voting states for the convenience of how we do that. And we've worked within the law. And of course, as you know, in these executive positions like the ones that Secretary Benson holds and that I hold, we are constrained by, and rightfully so, to follow the laws of our state. And we've worked within the law to make it easier than it's ever been in Ohio. In fact, of course, most Ohioans know that the simplest way to return your absentee ballot is to mail it in. That's a trustworthy way to do it. You can track it to make sure it's received at your Board of Elections. And so that's the way most Ohioans will return their absentee ballot. But for those that don't want to return it via mail, they can go in person to the Board of Elections, or they can have a family member bring it to the Board of Elections. And we've actually expanded drop boxes in Ohio so that every county now has one for the first time in a general election ever in our state's history. So every one of our 88 county boards of elections has a secure 24/7 drop box available that people can visit at any time between now and election day. Now, it's unfortunate that there's this heated, sometimes partisan rhetoric that confuses or causes people to have maybe an elevated level of concern. Of course, it's important for us always to sort of call out where there are problems so that they can be fixed. But far too often we see politicians that kind of push the hyperbole button maybe more than they should and elevate elections concerns to a level of hysteria that shouldn't be. Because of some of that really heated partisan rhetoric, there are people that are just terrified about mailing in their ballot when they shouldn't be. It's trustworthy to mail in your ballot. You can track it and make sure that it's received at your Board of Elections. So it's important for us to combat that misinformation and remind people that voting by mail is a secure way to do it. And if you want to put a stamp on your ballot and mail it in, that's still really the most convenient way to return your ballot.
For what it's worth, I voted by mail, and I got confirmation from my Board of Elections today that it was received. So for at least anecdotally, I will validate that last point. Let's talk about Election Day, right? This is going to be an election day like no other. How do you and your colleagues in the other states prepare to hold an election day? Because look, despite everything we're talking about and the record number of people who are going to vote early, there's still a lot of people who want to vote on Election Day in the more traditional, go to their local polling place model. How do you prepare for that in the middle of a pandemic?
I'll start by just saying we've got really three focuses that we've identified. Number one is operating precinct-based voting on Election Day. Number two is the absentee counting board process of tabulating all those ballots that came in early that in Michigan cannot begin being tabulated until Election Day. And then the third is preparing for the reporting of the results, which of course will evolve as we go through the process. On the first of just allowing and having and hosting Election Day voting, the top of mind has been ensuring we've got enough people and places to host those locations so that we can keep every precinct open. When you saw long lines in Georgia and Wisconsin early on in the spring, they had to close and consolidate precincts because they didn't have enough people to work them, and they didn't have enough places that could host the in-person voting. So recognizing that in April, we've been working since then. We've recruited over 30,000 election workers to ensure that we could meet the needs of every one of our 5,000 precincts and keep them open throughout the state. And then secondly, we have worked with our sports teams and others to ensure that where a school or a traditional polling location was not able to be used, we could supplement that with an alternative location. And so we're ready to go in that regard. We've also provided PPE for all of our election workers, like as I mentioned before. So in-person voting is ready to go. And then the second vector is the absentee voting process. We've created more capacity there to ensure we've got more machines tabulating ballots, more workers recruited and trained to increase the efficiency and methodical nature of that secure tabulation. And so we're ready to go there as well. And then the third piece is the reporting, which we will, beginning on Election Day itself, be prioritizing, both in response to things that may be emerging, rumors and the like, or just Election Day things that are happening. But then, of course, in the days that follow, as our election workers continue to process and tabulate all of those millions of ballots that will have been voted early, and continuing to keep the public updated on that. So we've got that communications plan in place, the voting plan in place, and the tabulation plan in place. And that's what our Election Day operation will entail.
It's important that that we start with understanding that early voting and absentee voting is a component of taking the pressure off of Election Day, because everybody that we can serve right now is one fewer voter that we have to serve on Election Day. And so it's important that we encourage that. And that's why we're so proud of the fact that we've had close to 200,000 early votes already cast in Ohio. In fact, today we may have gone over that number. And we've had 2.5 million Ohioans that have already requested that absentee ballot. That helps to reduce lines on Election Day. But you're right, there has to be that in-person voting opportunity. That's something we believe in. In Ohio, we opened close to 4,000 polling locations spread all throughout the state. Those 4,000 polling locations have to be staffed by 37,000 Ohioans, those Election Day poll workers that do this really important and patriotic work of running those polling locations. Now, we identified this long before the pandemic as a priority, and I started working on poll worker recruitment really early on in my administration. We created a poll worker recruitment task force and came up with these 5 distinct recruiting programs. I'm happy to say it's working. Obviously, that work got even more important this spring when we realized that we were going to have to replace poll workers that may opt out this year because maybe their age puts them in a certain category where they're more concerned about the impacts the virus could have on them. So I told you 37,000 is the bare minimum. Of course, we don't do anything at the bare minimum in elections. We always build in redundancy and backup planning. And so we really set the number at 55,000 that we want to recruit. I'm happy to report that we're now over 50,000. We're well past the 37,000 that we needed, but we're close to that 55,000 so that we have that backup reserve force of poll workers trained and ready to go. We've also tracked that in a very accountable way by just putting it on our website. We operate a poll worker tracker where anybody can see how well their county's doing. Some counties are ahead, some counties are behind. That's an accountability point. And that's something that we're proud of as well, to make sure that no voter gets to a polling location on the morning of Tuesday, November 3rd and finds a locked door, right? That's the worst case scenario, and one of the things that we want to make sure doesn't happen. Now, as it relates to the health scenario, of course, what I've been telling Ohioans is if you feel comfortable going to the grocery store, you should feel comfortable coming to your polling locations, because in many cases, the health protocols that we've implemented are really state of the art. We've worked with the CDC as well as the Ohio Department of Health. I put this document out almost 2 months ago, and this is a 61-point checklist. I'm a big believer in checklists. It's a great way to organize a complex set of tasks, and the boards of elections will be required to follow the 61-point checklist. And when they do, they will create a healthy environment for both voters and poll workers. Of course, it's all the things you expect. It's mask requirements. It's making sure that we have shields in place where people have to be closer than 6 feet, but wherever we can create that social distancing, making sure that we're spreading voting machines out, for example, wiping down commonly touched surfaces. We've had donations of massive quantities of masks and hand sanitizers from great patriotic companies that have stepped up to make sure that we have everything we need. And then again, also using some of those federal dollars that we got to supplement that with purchases of personal protective equipment. So we'll be well supplied to create that healthy environment at our polling locations. I want to talk just briefly about election night reporting as well, because Secretary Benson touched on that. And it's important for people to understand, and this is just kind of a civics lesson. And I've been, every chance I get, reminding people how election night reporting really works. And of course, it's different in every state, but it follows a similar model. I get the question a lot, will we have the final results on election night? The answer is, of course not, because we never have the final results on election night. It's just not the way that election night reporting works. Here in Ohio, what we're going to report on election night, and that may go into the wee hours of Wednesday morning or what have you, but we're going to report every ballot we've received so far. That means the early votes, the absentee votes, and the in-person election day votes. But that's not all the ballots we will receive, because our boards of elections may continue receiving ballots for 10 days after the election. As long as it's postmarked by November 2nd, it's a legal ballot and deserves to be counted. And so that election night report is a snapshot in time. Now, we're used to this thing where in the past few decades, that's been conclusive enough that you can see that election night result and sort of draw your conclusion about what the final tally is going to be. But here's where that may not be the case this year, because we know that we're going to see record numbers of absentee votes. I hope everybody waits. I hope nobody waits. I hope everybody mails them in quickly, but some people will procrastinate until the last minute. And so there will be outstanding absentee ballots. And so here's where we're changing our election night reporting website. And I think this is something that a lot of other states should look at as well. We know the number of outstanding absentee ballots. That is a knowable number. We keep very careful track of the ballots that go out and the ballots that come back. The delta, the difference there is that number of outstanding ballots. And so for the first time ever, we're going to highlight that number of outstanding absentee ballots right at the top of our election night reporting website. Here's a hypothetical why that could actually be quite important. Now imagine your favorite candidate, let's just say for president, but there's important races all the way down the ballot. Let's say your favorite candidate for president is leading by 1 million votes on election night, and there are 200,000 outstanding absentee ballots. Well, you can look at that and draw the conclusion that that's a conclusive number. You know who's going to win that race. But the flip side of that, imagine a scenario, which is entirely possible here in Ohio as well, where your favorite candidate's only ahead by 100,000 votes on election night, and there are yet 200,000 outstanding absentee ballots. Well, just by definition, then, that contest is not over yet, and we have to allow time for those remaining ballots to come in over the next 10 days so that we can give a conclusive result when we certify the final results. And so this is a matter where it may require some patience, but we're putting the data out there so that people can make those sort of data driven decisions and informed decisions and be fully transparent about exactly where we are on election night and where those results could be going in the days after that.
I think it's an important point you're making, because there are people out there who are saying if we don't know on election night, then that means something's afoot, right? There's something nefarious going on out there. But the takeaway from this conversation is we will not know. It is very likely that we may not know on election night based on all the data we have because of outstanding votes or the pace of counting outstanding votes, right?
And when the numbers between election night and the final certified result change, and they invariably do change every election, because again, we have to allow time for those trailing absentee ballots to come in. We have to allow time to resolve the provisional ballots that have come in. And so when those numbers change between that unofficial report on election night and the final certified result weeks later, that, as you said, is not the sign of something nefarious. In fact, it's the manifestation of that commitment you hear every elections official make, that every vote matters. Whether it's one of my former teammates who's voting in the military from overseas, or an Ohioan that just procrastinates and waits to the last minute, those legally cast ballots deserve to be counted. And so, no, nothing's going wrong when the numbers change between the unofficial report on election night and the final tally potentially weeks later. It's actually the process playing out as it should to make sure every legally cast ballot can be counted.
So I want to get to audience questions in a moment. So members of the audience, again, you can feel free to submit your questions at the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. But before we turn to them, I actually want to cover one more bucket. And I'm going to try to jam a couple of questions into one in the interest of time. And that's election security. And I want to talk about it from a couple of angles, right? I mean, Secretary Benson, we saw sort of like the extreme manifestation of this with the recent thankfully thwarted plot against the governor. But there is increased chatter about election day and in the period following whether or not there's enough security around, physical security around our election system. But the second part I also would love for you to address, which was a big topic, 4 years ago, was foreign interference and attempts by foreign actors to try to infiltrate our election systems and infrastructure. And so I'm wondering if you can each talk a little bit about election security from both of those angles. And Secretary Benson, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Certainly election security is something that we all take very seriously and place of the utmost importance. What has manifested itself, and to kind of put it succinctly, over the past several months, is that misinformation is the most pernicious risk to election security this year. And we saw this early on. Upon taking office, launched an election security task force, bringing both former secretaries of state from Colorado and other locations, federal authorities, as well as academics together to advise us, to evaluate our election security top to bottom. And we identified 3 areas within the election security infrastructure that we needed to focus on, shore up. And then the 4th, battling misinformation as the biggest emerging need. Those 3 first areas are 1, voter registration lists, making sure those are secured. Number 2, the machines themselves that tabulate ballots, and we've implemented step-by-step risk limiting audits to ensure ballots that we do have paper ballots, and to ensure that the machines are accurately tabulating those ballots and we can have a record of that. And then 3rd, focusing on the transmission of results to ensure that that is secure as well. And we have both increased protocols and checks and balances around that as well to ensure that the unofficial results, when sent to our central tabulation location on election night, are securely transmitted, and then we have checks and balances there as well. So we basically shored up the security of our election infrastructure, and I'm proud that we've recently been given an A, one of the only states in the country, one of only 3 states to be given an A in our election security and cybersecurity awareness and preparation for November. The last piece, however, is that misinformation, which I mentioned, that hacking of the voter's mind, which I see as, again, the most pernicious source of not just election security, but also potential for voter suppression. Because if voters believe their vote's not going to count and they choose not to vote, that is a form of voter suppression. We have seen this particularly in Michigan, whether it's coming from foreign or domestic actors trying to sow seeds of doubt among our voters about their vote, about the sanctity of their vote, about the process itself. One example that you may have seen were robocalls that were sent to thousands of Detroit residents saying, if you vote by mail, all these bad things will happen. We have actually set up a portal, michigan.gov/election security, to push back with accurate information about all that we've done to secure our elections. And then it's an organic website that will respond to misinformation that we get in the weeks and days ahead. We've set up an email address, misinformation@michigan.gov, that we're heavily promoting and that receives, all of the different things, whether they be text messages that people are receiving saying you've been purged from the rolls, you can't vote, or other types of tactics that are meant to, again, sow seeds of doubt among our voters about the security of their process. The bottom line, I've also partnered with the Attorney General to seek swift justice for those who would intimidate voters or otherwise violate the law. The bottom line is we're using every tool at our disposal to counter misinformation with facts and accurate information. And we, again, see that as part of our overall election security plan.
Let me start with kind of the 3 different buckets that we have here, because we've got cybersecurity and we've got sort of hacking, if you will. And we've also got disinformation, and then we've got the threats of physical violence. Really, all of them are ugly threats that have to be taken very seriously, with a similar intent behind each, right? And that is to disrupt or cause Americans to distrust or not want to participate in our elections. And that's why we take every one of them so seriously. So starting with the cybersecurity imperative and the need to protect our systems, it's also important to bifurcate that conversation into 2 separate things. First of all, the elections infrastructure that actually collects ballots, that tabulates ballots, those systems are never connected to the internet. It's important for people to understand that. They're kept under double lock and key at our county boards of elections. There's actually a Republican key and a Democratic key. It's like those old submarine movies from the 1980s where it takes 2 keys to launch the torpedo. Those machines are kept under double lock and key at the county boards of elections. They are, of course, tested and certified at both the federal and state level in Ohio. They go through a full battery of tests before each election called a logic and accuracy test, where technical experts from both parties observe the machines being put through their paces to make sure that they are working accurately. Of course, in Ohio, we also do post-election auditing, and the reason that's possible is every ballot has a paper trail, a physical paper trail that goes with it, so you can compare the electronic record to the paper record. And so, of course, any piece of electronic equipment, if someone can put their hands on it, could be tampered with. But as far as tampering with actual elections administration or actual elections infrastructure, that's a pretty far-fetched thing. And if someone were to engage in that type of crime, it would be very quickly uncovered, and you would know about it and then be able to mitigate that. So it's important to understand the other side, though, where many aspects of elections are on the internet by their very nature. The Board of Elections website, the email systems that boards of elections use, the election night reporting, the voter registration registration and online voter registration systems and voter registration databases. And so many things are on the internet and therefore need to be protected. In Ohio, we launched an initiative a year ago that put in place some I think, really state-of-the-art protections where each of our 88 county boards of elections are required to follow, again, a very precise checklist of security measures they need to take. We mobilized the vast majority of our federal HAVA money to be spent for this purpose. We've not only focused on the hardware and software side of things, but also the human aspect of it, because invariably, when there is an intrusion into a system, there's almost always a human error that occurred that created that opportunity or that vector for attack. And so training our people to be that human firewall has been a major focus of our work as well. So cybersecurity is something that we take very seriously. And we've had some success stories. We've successfully fended off a few cyber attacks here in recent months. And we've made that known publicly because it's important for people to know the facts on these kind of things. But as it relates to disinformation, those kind of cyber attacks are often used to plant the seeds of doubt that are then fanned through disinformation operations. Now, let's not overcomplicate this. Disinformation, just a few years ago, we would have called it propaganda, right? It's simply spreading false information with a specific strategic purpose in mind, right? And Jocelyn used a term, Secretary Benson used a term that I've been using as well. The bad guys know that they can't really hack our elections, and so instead they've tried to hack our voters, right? They've tried to hack the minds of people by spreading false information and by trying to flood the zone with a lot of confusing nonsense. And that happens on social media. It happens through a variety of different things. And that kind of thing has to be taken very seriously. In Ohio, we've worked with specifically minority community leaders because it's an ugly truth that our minority communities have been more often targeted for disinformation, because what these disinformation operators want to do is find an existing wedge issue and then sort of fan the flames of that and use that to divide us and cause people to self-disenfranchise, right? And so we've worked with minority community leaders to help educate them on what does disinformation look like and how do we counteract it. We have an email address that people use to report disinformation to us. It's just report@ohiosos.gov, report@ohiosos.gov. We take every one of those very seriously. In fact, we've worked with Secretary Benson's office on something that did cross between Ohio and Michigan, and thankfully the bad guys were caught. But again, we have to be constantly vigilant about that. Let me finish on physical security. Polling places are special places. They are afforded a special status under law, at least in Ohio's law. These are places that are protected, where voters can come in a very open and unintimidating way to exercise their fundamental rights as a voter. It's a place where poll workers should feel safe in conducting the very important and patriotic work that they're doing. No form of voter intimidation or harassment will ever be tolerated in Ohio, and it's something that we take very seriously. Now, of course, around those polling locations, there is a 100-foot buffer zone. Inside of that buffer zone, there's no campaigning. There may be credentialed elections observers, but those individuals may not be armed or uniformed. They simply have to be there to just observe and then report what they see to their respective campaigns and parties. Outside of that 100-foot buffer, of course, on public property, people are free to exercise their First Amendment rights, to pass out flyers for their favorite candidate, to hold a sign in support of their favorite candidate. But what will never be tolerated is anything that impedes voters coming and going or creates a hostile or intimidating environment. I had a conference call last week with our county sheriffs all throughout the state of Ohio and made clear to them in the form of a memo that I sent to them exactly what Ohio law lays out and what the expectations are. And I have every confidence that local law enforcement will conduct themselves appropriately to make sure that we create that safe and welcoming environment at every polling location. Just to be very blunt about it, any kind of nonsense at a polling location will not be tolerated in any way.
Okay, thank you. I have so many more questions I would like to ask, but the students always have better questions than I do. So let's go to them. When I call on you, please introduce yourself, who you are, your Georgetown affiliation, and where you're Zooming from. So let's go to the first question from Alex.
Hi, so I'm Alex. I'm a first-year student in the Data Science and Public Policy Master's program at the McCourt School. And I'm actually also an alumnus of Secretary Benson's office. I was an intern there last summer. And I can honestly say that I'm here at Georgetown in no small part because of that experience and that internship. So thank you for that. My question about this election is that 2020 poses a very particular set of challenges with regard to election security and administration. what have been the most challenging things, the most difficult aspects of preparing for this election? What things have been most challenging to overcome or to adjust with regard to the planning?
You know, there have been a lot of challenges. Obviously, the pandemic is one of them. But I have to be truthful and say the biggest challenge has been partisan politics in various different levels. Partisan politics that held up needed election funding at the federal level. Partisan politics that held up needed legislative updates for us. And I know this is something Secretary LaRose has fought through as well, and that we've commiserated with because neither of us are partisan people, to be honest. We're just here because we want to serve and do a job. I feel like a plumber most days, right? My job is just to keep everything running. So to also, have best practices, data that says we need to do X, Y, Z, and then to not be able to execute because of partisanship and partisan and politicking, misinformation that has flown through our states to further partisan or political agendas and confuse voters as a result. If we could really remove partisanship and politics from politics, I think we'd get so much more done. But certainly if we could remove it from election administration as it should be, we would certainly be able to, I think, avoid a lot of the challenges we've encountered this year in Michigan and my colleagues have encountered in other states. And I'll just say one of the things that's been so gratifying this year is that in the midst of this hyperpartisan electoral climate, to have bipartisan relationships with secretaries of state all around the country, certainly having Frank in Ohio, but other colleagues like in West Virginia and Iowa, Paul Pate, Mac Warner in West Virginia, Laura Lee in Florida, and then, Kathy Bookvar in Pennsylvania, and basically colleagues on both sides of the aisle. We've been working together. We've been grappling with the same issues. We've been sharing best practices. We've been supporting each other. And that's demonstrated that, again, behind the scenes or hopefully out in front, our election administration system and our election administrators really do seek to be above the partisanship and just serve as those referees in this very hyper-partisan environment, making sure that regardless of how someone votes or who they vote for, that their vote counts.
Secretary Benson's right to call out the partisanship because it really has no place in elections administration. And this is where Jocelyn and I are kind of kindred spirits. She's a Democrat from Michigan. I'm a Republican from Ohio. People would think, how could a Democrat from Michigan and a Republican from Ohio agree on anything? But we connected early on around this idea that elections administration should not be partisan. Now, the partisanship is for the issues, the debates that need to go on, those robust debates about that sort of free market of ideas that needs to happen in American politics, where we have those civil and thorough debates on the issues. But when it comes to elections administration, there's really no place for partisanship. Secretaries of state, and I appreciated that she mentioned many of our colleagues around the country, secretaries of state should wear the referee's jersey. There's no room for putting your thumb on the scale. In fact, that kind of thing is completely inappropriate, in my opinion. What secretaries of state should do is follow the laws and make sure that everybody has an opportunity to vote. And so the partisanship has been concerning, and I've seen it from both sides of the aisle, and I've called it out in a equal way. And by the way, that can be uncomfortable when it's someone from your own party that needs to be called out. But I've not hesitated to do that because I believe, again, that this work is so much more than a political identity. This kind of tribalism of modern American politics has just gone too far. And really, if you think about what we do as secretaries of state, we safeguard the very underpinnings of our democracy. The basic idea, that basic philosophy of a democracy is that the only legitimacy any elected official has comes from the consent of the governed. Right? I mean, without the consent of the governed, you're just a guy or gal with flags and a seal. I mean, it doesn't mean a thing unless you've actually been empowered by the people to do this work. And the only way, truly, that we establish that consent of the governed is through a free and fair and accessible election that people know and trust intuitively was a fair contest. So in that sense, the work that we do shouldn't have anything to do with partisanship. Now, where it gets disappointing is where, because of partisanship, good ideas get stalled in the state legislature, or because of partisanship, sometimes candidates' messaging, again, sort of relies on this hyperbole. Let me be clear. Voter fraud is exceedingly rare. Voter suppression, I believe, is also rare. Neither one of those are ever acceptable. Reasonable people should be able to say, we won't tolerate fraud. We won't tolerate suppression. We'll do smart things to prevent either of those ugly things from ever occurring. But when you get this heated rhetoric of folks on the right wanting to say there's all this fraud and folks on the left wanting to say there's all this suppression, what it does is kind of does our foreign adversaries work for them. I mean, let's be honest, the Russians, the North Koreans, the Chinese, the Iranians, what they want to do is cause us to fight amongst ourselves and distrust the systems of our democracy. And so when an American politician says, look at all this fraud, well, what that's doing is causing people to distrust the very institutions of our democracy. When people for partisan reasons say, hey, it's so hard to vote. In Ohio, it's not hard to vote. Ohioans know it's not hard to vote. But when you say it's hard to vote, it has the result of making people not want to vote. Because why would you want to participate in a process that's so hard to be part of or that's so full of fraud? In fact, neither of those are ever true. And that's why we shouldn't be doing our foreign adversaries work for them by hyping the partisan sort of hyperbole about elections administration.
Alex, thanks for the question. I want to try to get at least a couple more in before we run out of time. So let's go next to Jack.
Thanks, Mo. And I'll just say to Secretary LaRose and Secretary Benson, it's very refreshing to hear two secretaries of state from someone who is somewhat worried about our elections coming up. It's very comforting to hear your words this evening. So my question is, last week or this week, there's been this event going on in California news story where state officials uncovered about 50 unofficial ballot drop or ballot harvesting boxes around the LA area. So I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts on that episode in general, or can tell us a little bit more about ballot harvesting, some of the dangers or potential for abuse there, and good practices surrounding it.
Sure.
I'm happy to start, Frank, and I'll just say, what this really underscores is the need for voter vigilance this year. That there will be attempts, as these were, to potentially confuse voters about how to return their ballots and how to ensure their ballots are counted. The statewide ballot tracking system that California has, that Michigan has, that Ohio, that other states have, helps to mitigate some of that, but voters need to be vigilant that there are going to be attempts, and they will continue in the weeks and days ahead, to confuse voters, to try to interfere with the process. This is an example of that. And that's why voters also need to seek out trusted sources of information. Their state secretary of states, their local election administrators in LA County, for example. That's where you can go to find your locations of drop boxes, to find out how you would get and return your ballot, to find out how you register to vote, and to ask questions of when you see something that seems odd, to report it, and so that we can get to the bottom of it. And that is really what happened in California. But it also underscores really this tense, pernicious environment that we're in, where the attempts to confuse our voters, to confuse our electorate, are going to come from many ways. And the number one thing is we have to recognize we're all in this together. Those of us who want democracy to work this year, we have to be vigilant against these attempts to use the tools at our disposal, be them the truth, the education, accurate information, to push back. And I've been really gratified to see that the vast majority of people in our country on both sides of the aisle, and the media and everywhere else, even in political parties, really are embracing that. And you just see really outlying circumstances like this one, and others who are, again, partisan actors trying to, in my view, sow seeds of doubt in the process and confuse voters about their rights. But it didn't succeed. And that's what's important to recognize. And in my view, there have been many other instances like that have been unsuccessful and will continue to be.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jack. I've got a cursory understanding of the issue in California, but it's not something that I'm particularly studied in, so I'm not going to get too far into that. But from what I've heard, it's certainly something that shouldn't be happening. I can tell you that here in Ohio, that kind of thing wouldn't happen, and simply the reason why is that in Ohio, we don't allow so-called ballot harvesting. The only person that can return your ballot to the Board of Elections is yourself or a family member or the U.S. Postal Service. And that's why the vast majority of people know the easiest thing to do is put your stamps on it, drop it in your mailbox, just like my wife Lauren and I did, and then track it to make sure that it's received. If you want to take it to the Board of Elections, you can do that as well. But it's also highlights why it's important to consider unintended consequences and really not make great changes to elections administration right before an election. It's important to have a stable and predictable system of elections. We need to innovate, but really those kind of things should be well considered and thought out. And that's why, in Ohio, I've resisted some of the kind of last minute changes that people have proposed, because it could unleash a level of chaos and uncertainty, and it could result in unintended consequences. And so in Ohio, I'm carrying out the law as it's written. What happened in California sounds just plainly inexcusable to me, though.
Thanks for the question, Jack. Let's try to get one more in, and we'll bring Ava back.
Hello, and thank you both for being here. Again, my name is Ava Vitanovic, and I'm a sophomore here at Georgetown, and I'm from Chicago. My question is about universal mail-in ballots. I recognize that some states have implemented universal mail-in ballots, and some states have not. To me, this signifies that there are both benefits and drawbacks to this strategy. My question is, what factors are in play when states consider whether a universal mail-in ballot system is right for them?
So here in Ohio, we like our choices, and that's one of the reasons why we've not moved in that direction, in my opinion. Of course, any change like that would require the state legislature to be involved in that kind of thing. Ohioans like the choices. You've got absentee voting if you want to vote by mail in Ohio. You've got early voting, and you've got election day voting. Now, one of the things that I think we need to do is modernize the way that we do absentee voting to make it easier for people to request a ballot. Right now, you have to return a dead tree piece of paper to your Board of Elections, and I think that that's incredibly antiquated. I think that we should put it online, and that's why 5 years ago, actually in the state Senate, I introduced a bill to create online absentee ballot requests, but unfortunately, we've not been able to get that done. And I think that that gives us a happy medium once we get a system like that in place where Ohioans can very simply request an absentee ballot. It's reasonably simple to do right now with the paper form, but it would be even easier if we put that process online. I know that one of the other concerns that is raised, and I know that in states like Oregon and Washington and California and Colorado and Nevada and Hawaii and Utah, I think those are all the states that do universal vote by mail. They really like the system. But one of the concerns that you'll hear people raise in Ohio and in other places is that in order to implement a system like that, you've got to do a really good job of maintaining an accurate voter list. Because if you don't, and let's be honest, a voter registration list is an incredibly dynamic list because people are constantly turning 18, passing away, moving into state, moving out of state, changing their names. I mean, the number of changes that happen on a daily basis to a voter registration list is mind-boggling. And if you don't really stay on top of that and maintain an accurate list, then by definition, if you mail an absentee ballot to everybody, you are going to be sending ballots to some people that are deceased, some people that have moved and are not going to get them at their new address because they were mailed to their old address. Those kind of things can happen. And so that's one of the concerns that is raised about a system of so-called universal vote by mail.
And I'll just add, in Michigan, it was voters that moved us in the direction of having a vote by mail system. And to me, these types of reforms really have to be driven by voters. I could see us potentially moving in a direction as other states have. That's sort of the evolution that the country is moving in. But as Secretary LaRose mentioned, there are many details that need to be worked out. Lists primarily, need to be updated. Our clerks need to have the resources to process the new system. And in Michigan, we're just in the sort of beginning stages of being a vote by mail state to begin with. And so this is really the first election cycle where we've had a right to vote by mail in our state, where you didn't have to state a reason. And that's going quite well. Voters are embracing it. And I imagine if voters want to continue moving in the direction and being a state where we essentially remove the request and have voters automatically receive ballots without requesting them, we'll move in that direction if that's what the voters want. But it's really got to be a voter-driven reform that we'll then respond to and then work to implement it, just as we've implemented automatic voter registration and a number of other reforms this year with an eye towards protecting the security of the system.
Thanks for the question, Ava. Secretary Benson, Secretary LaRose, our motto here at the Institute is public service is a good thing. Politics can be too. And sometimes it's hard to make the case, but if we ever really want people to believe it, it's all got to start with the integrity of our election system. And so I want to thank both of you for what you do and for spending some time with us tonight answering the Georgetown community's questions about some of the issues regarding the integrity of this year's election. Thank you both. Thanks to those of you who tuned in tonight. If you're a member of the Georgetown community, I encourage you, if you haven't yet, come up with your plan to vote and vote. Follow GU Votes, our student-run organization that's dedicated towards improving the voting culture at Georgetown. They've got all sorts of information on a state-by-state basis of how to return your ballots, when to return your ballots, where to return your ballots, the deadlines. But please come up with your plan. And if you haven't done so already, please vote. And with that, I want to thank you all for spending part of your evening with us tonight. Have a good night.